Amy Lyon was born as a blacksmith's daughter at Swan College in Cheshire, in England, in the spring of 1765. She later adopted the name Emma Hart, married Sir William Hamilton, the British ambassador to the court of Naples in southern Italy, and subsequently became the lover of Horatio Nelson, Britain's foremost naval commander during the Napoleonic Wars, and their relationship would later scandalise British society in the early 19th century. The woman who would later become one of the most famed beauties of the Romantic era in Britain and Europe was born at Swan Cottage near Neston in Cheshire, England, on the 26th of April 1765. Her father was Henry Lyon, a blacksmith who sadly died within 7 weeks of Emma's birth. Coming from a relatively impoverished background, a situation which was worsened by her father's untimely death, Emma had no choice but to enter the workforce when she was young. This occurred in her early teens, which was quite a common situation in the early industrial era Britain, before the introduction of universal primary education. By age 12, she was working as a maid, and shortly afterwards moved to London. Various positions followed in the years ahead. It was while in her teenage years that she changed her name to Emma Hart and began a relationship with Charles Greville, a British antiquarian and Member of Parliament between 1774 and 1790. Their relationship lasted for 4 years, during which Emma was also alleged to have worked for the flamboyant showman and quack James Graham. In 1785, Greville ended what had been an extended relationship by sending Emma to his uncle, Sir William Hamilton, who was then serving as a British plenipotentiary at the court of Naples, where she arrived in 1786. Emma would subsequently marry Hamilton in 1791, and as a woman in her mid-20s at the Neapolitan court, she became a hostess. Here she met with many of Europe's leading literary figures, and also became the subject of many portraits, including those by celebrated portrait artists of the day, such as Gavin Hamilton, Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun, and Angelica Kauffman. These depicted Emma in line with classical and mythological portraiture, often portraying figures such as Medea, Ariadne, and Cleopatra, and began to establish her fame throughout Europe. In particular, James Gilray's representation of Emma became well known. However, above being a model solely for artistic work, Emma was able to exploit her talent for imitation and the period's construction of gender to her own advantage. She was, for instance, an excellent hostess who was able to charm men of power. This would play a role in her subsequent relationship with Horatio Nelson. Emma's life at the Neapolitan court between the mid-1780s and the late 1790s was playing out within the context of great political change across Europe. In 1789, a revolution in France overthrew the monarchical government of King Louis XVI. Eventually, in the years that followed, this intensified and led to the execution of Louis by the French revolutionary government in 1793. The French Republic had consequently become a political enemy for virtually all of Europe's great powers, which were immensely troubled by the idea that the revolutionary principles being adopted in France would disrupt their own political situations. Accordingly, shortly after the outbreak of the French Revolution of 1789, France would find itself constantly at war with countries such as Austria, Prussia, Russia, and above all, Britain. This was the context in which Horatio Nelson arrived at the Bourbon court of Naples in 1793. Nelson was by that time a leading admiral of the British Royal Navy, one who had held many senior commands in the Mediterranean. He wore his career heavily. He had been blinded in one eye during an engagement near Corsica, shortly before his arrival to Naples. As a highly accomplished leader on these waters, Nelson's task in the autumn of 1793 was to gather reinforcements for the renewed conflict between France and the European powers. This was just an early moment in what became the wider Mediterranean campaign of 1793 to 1796, a long series of naval engagements between the British Royal Navy stationed in the ports of Italy and the French Revolutionary Fleet at Toulon in southern France. In this protracted naval operation hung the result of the battle for control of the Italian peninsula. The mission would also lead to Nelson's encounter with Lady Emma Hamilton. Emma was first introduced to Nelson very shortly after his arrival in southern Italy. This was in her capacity as the wife of the British envoy to the Neapolitan court, Sir William, or Lord Hamilton. Not only was Emma thus married, but Nelson also was, having married Fanny Nisbet in 1787. Fanny was a devoted wife, and while Lord Hamilton would soon come to accept Lady Emma and Nelson's affair, the Admiral's wife never did. An attraction was quickly evident between Lady Hamilton and Admiral Nelson. The Hamiltons invited Nelson to stay at their official residence while he was in Naples, drumming up support for British efforts in the Mediterranean. When he left several days later, a lasting impression had clearly been made by the pair on each other. There the matter might have ended, but 5 years later, Nelson found himself back in Naples. By this time, the French were increasingly ascendant throughout continental Europe, led militarily by a brilliant general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who would subsequently make himself Emperor of France. However, while Bonaparte might have dominated on land, Nelson was the greatest naval commander of the day, a fact which has been solidified with a monumental victory over the French at the Battle of the Nile in August 1798. It was while travelling back across the Mediterranean that he stopped at Naples in late September 1798. Lady Hamilton might well have been shocked by Nelson's changed appearance. He had lost his right arm since his first visit, and was prematurely aged by years at sea. The Hamiltons made him their guest in Naples, and there was soon a full-blown relationship occurring between the 33-year-old Emma and the 40-year-old Admiral. Lord Hamilton, for perhaps many reasons which are not abundantly clear, decided to turn a blind eye to his wife's infidelities with their houseguest. It seems likely that Hamilton was sterile, and guilt at being unable to provide Emma with children may have contributed to his willingness to allow his wife to engage in the affair. By November 1798, news had reached the British newspapers about Nelson's affair in Italy. Henceforth, Lady Emma and her already famous lover would be the subject of sustained media scrutiny in England. Some of their actions simply generated casual interest, but most of British high society was appalled. This obsession with the pair would only become greater in the years ahead, as both they and Lord Hamilton all returned to England. In 1799, a popular revolt occurred in Naples, and eventually would lead to Napoleon imposing a new French royal family there. As these events unfolded, many members of the British Embassy and British community, which had emerged there during the intermittent wars with France of the 1790s, started to make their way back to Britain. When they reached London in November 1800, tensions arose immediately between Nelson, his mistress, and Lord Hamilton on the one side, and Nelson's wife and wider family on the other. The affair was well known of by all involved before their return to Britain, but the actual physical presence of the trio back in England created tensions which now could not be easily ignored. This was compounded when Nelson's wife, Fanny, quickly realised that Lady Emma was pregnant with Nelson's child. Unlike Emma's husband, Lord Hamilton, she would never willingly accept the affair. In an effort to keep the peace, Nelson took up residence with his wife and their family, while the Hamiltons lived separately at a number of London addresses. Yet, when Fanny delivered an ultimatum to Nelson to choose between her or Lady Emma, it pushed his decision. Shortly before returning to active naval duty in 1801, he commenced formal separation proceedings with Fanny, which is a much more unusual thing to do in the early 19th century than it has become in modern times. Moreover, in late January 1801, Nelson and Emma's daughter was born. They named her Horatio. By now, as Nelson was absent abroad on active naval duty, Emma had begun to court English high society in an effort to win over public opinion for her and Nelson's cause. Remarkably, this might have further fueled the London rumour mills, as during one of her social events, the Prince of Wales, the future King George IV, became infatuated with Lady Emma, though nothing resulted from his pursuit of her. That autumn, on Emma's advice, Nelson organised the purchase of Merton Place, a house in Wimbledon where they now lived together openly, Lady Emma, Lord Hamilton, and Admiral Nelson, following his return to England when the Treaty of Amiens of March 1802 brought war between Britain and France to an end again briefly. Lord Hamilton died in April 1803, finally dampening some of the criticisms which London society continued to offer against the ménage à trois which they had been living in. But Lady Emma and Admiral Nelson would not be able to enjoy a more conventional marital relationship, as Lord Nelson only outlived Hamilton by 2 years. Nelson, the man who had received so many injuries in the course of his naval career, finally succumbed to one in 1805. Peace between Britain and France only lasted for 1 year, following the Treaty of Amiens. In May 1803, what is usually termed the War of the Third Coalition broke out, with Britain, Russia, Sweden and Austria combining against France and her European satellite states, including Italy and Spain. One of Napoleon's major strategies as a part of this renewed conflict was to attempt an invasion of Britain. But in order to do this, he needed to bring the French navy, which was largely stationed in the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar and north into the English Channel. When this was attempted in 1805, Nelson was set the task of preventing the operation. On the 21st of November, the British Royal Navy, led by Nelson, defeated a joint Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar, off the coast of southwestern Spain. No French invasion force could now pass from France to Britain, but Nelson's most glorious victory was his last. He was seriously wounded during the engagement and died just 3 hours later. Emma was distraught when news reached England. She took to bed with grief for several weeks, but in the long run, there was the issue of Nelson's will to be attended to. The British state was determined to exclude Lady Emma as much as possible in the division of the Admiral's estate, and to Nelson's own wishes that his lands and wealth be fairly and evenly divided between Emma and his legitimate family was ignored. Emma received a £2,000 payment, the house at Merton, and a £500 annual payment. But with the cost of maintaining Merton being much greater than this annuity, she was soon in financial trouble. Additionally, the £500 annual payment became the subject of a further legal struggle with Nelson's family. As a consequence, by 1808, she was more than £15,000 in debt, and efforts to sell Merton were unsuccessful. The culmination of the whole episode did not come until 1812, when Lady Hamilton was briefly imprisoned for failing to meet her vast debt repayments. A succession of health problems followed in the years ahead. Eventually, some money was raised by friends, which allowed Lady Emma and her daughter Horatio to escape to Calais in France. Yet, she died here just a year later, at 49 years of age, having increasingly succumbed to alcoholism and obesity in her later life. A tragic end for a woman who had once been famed throughout Europe for the portraits depicting her beauty. Yet, she is well remembered even today, having been the subject of many books, songs and films during the 20th century, most notably the 1973 film Bequest to the Nation, starring Glenda Jackson and Peter Finch, and Susan Sontag's 1992 novel The Volcano Lover, a romance. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Emma Hamilton. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave me a like and a comment down below, and if you're new, why not subscribe? Please make sure to have notifications turned on so you get all my videos as soon as they're uploaded. And if you have any suggestions, you can find my email and Instagram down in the description, which is the easiest way for me to find or see the suggestions that you have for me. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks!